I'm gonna be you're here, but I'm gonna be like pretending like you're right here, and then
Okay.
go from there. Okay. Three, two, one. Welcome back to Myth Vision Podcast. I'm your host, Derek Lambert. Today, I have another special revisit of Myth Vision with Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. Welcome back.
Hi, thanks for having me. It's nice to see you again.
Thank you. Thank you. I hear you're going to be at this Paul conference and talking about this guy whom we've done a course on as well. The Apostle Paul, who there's so many interpretations. There's so many books written about this guy. Can you tell us what you're going to be discussing at the NINT 2024? And for the viewers, if you haven't signed up, check out the conference. Sign up now. I hope to see you there. There's going to be some great names: Paula Fredrickson, James Tabor, Jennifer Knust, and I'm interested in talking about that little side segment that you and her are going to have as well.
Okay. Well, yeah, so a bunch of us are getting together. I think it's the second year that we've been doing this new insights into the New Testament, which I think is great because not only is it great to have this outreach and try to talk to people about what's going on in scholarship, but I like that Bart Ehrman is specifically targeting new insights. So this will be a great way for scholars to present really their cutting edge research, but to try to do so in a way where we're not making it, too complex, which let's face it, a lot of us have a tendency to do. So we are really complementing each other and each coming up with a different approach to reimagining Paul. Because, like you said, there are 10,000 different books out there and perspectives on the guy. And I think, there's always the old tension between kind of the theological Paul and the historical Paul, you might say, in a way. And so we're taking an entirely different approach here by talking about what some new scholarship and new ideas about that tension, but also about what we've been learning about Paul from that historical perspective, what's been going on in these
If I,
different kind of
if I may
conversations.
probe into this with you, because this
Yeah.
is it fascinates me. I'm imagining conservative Christians, those who are like really involved in the church, they think they've had Paul figured out forever. And we're now kind of re-investigating this in the past few hundred years, trying to do so without that, like you said, theological or even church perception of what Paul believed and his doctrines. So let me ask you another way, as you've investigated Paul deeply and read, I'm sure, several different scholarly takes. Do you think that we have figured out the guy and that scholarship, because to get your PhD, you have to always break the boundary of what everyone else is kind of doing in order to achieve that? Do you think we're going past where we've already figured out who the guy was, and now everyone has to kind of reinvent the guy and keep reinventing him like in 1,000 years from now?
No,
No.
I
Okay.
mean, I think I said a minute ago, like, let's face it, there's a lot out there. But the funny thing is, I'm thinking to myself how the other day, like, even, I have like text change with other text chains, with like other scholars, and somebody was like, what is this guy talking about? Right? Like, I still think to this day we kind of struggle with that. I'm not sure that anybody's been able to pin him down. There are a lot of reasons for that. I mean, one is the natural thing of, like, he's writing letters, and so you're getting one side of a conversation, and one that he's curated, right? Like, he has a very particular idea of what he wants to present about himself. There's all kinds of biases and rhetoric involved in that you have to untangle as a scholar. There's also sort of this perception that he founded the church, or that these are Pauline communities he's writing to. And of course, we know, if you actually read the letters, that that's not really the case either. Like, that's not very descriptive, because there are all these fault lines and struggles that are going on, as you would expect with the development of, trying to coalesce a new movement. So back to this conference, we're all kind of taking a different approach to Paul. But one thing that I'm going to do in my presentation is talk about how Paul is a philosopher. And what I mean by that is one area that needs further research. And it's been going on for a few decades, but again, like, these wheels turn slowly, and it can be hard to convey, especially if you're not in the field, exactly what those conversations have been. But we do know that Paul, especially, if you read him in the original Greek, is using all kinds of ancient terminology. And you and I have talked about this, that make him a very good Middle Platonist of the
Mhm.
first century, meaning he's combining Platonism and Stoicism. And certain ideas that we kind of take for granted, we've talked about pneuma before,
Yeah. In the
which
course for
translates.
anybody. Yeah, we
Oh,
have.
in our course, but also I know we did like one Myth Vision interview too, where I explained that this is the word that we translate as spirit. And because we have this whole, like all these layers of theology over what spirit means, and also kind of cultural ideas about like we have a spirit, the spirit's around us, the spirit like as part of the Trinity, right? Like none of that existed for Paul. For Paul, and I think once you read him in this way, spirit is actually a substance, it's a physical thing. And he's trying to describe how you can be changed by taking in this physical substance that's really refined. It's invisible to the naked eye. It's associated with how God has influence in the world. If you take that into yourself and it mixes with your body, it's going to change who your parents are, right? Meaning, like, it
Right.
changes your lineage. All of a sudden, now you are a son of God, like Jesus is a son of God. That's why he talks about being a co-heir with Christ. It's going to change your family tree, essentially. It's going to change your attitude towards things like how to behave. He always is talking about, like, why aren't you behaving the right way? Well, it's because you have this God stuff in you. You should know the right way to behave. There are all kinds of ways that it has influence in Paul's letters and impacts how he talks to the people he's writing to. And I think if you understand his approach and grasp of philosophy, it really does, again, change some of these ideas we sort of take for granted about him.
That is very interesting. Made my wheels turn in my head while you were speaking of things that come to mind of constantly producing new godly offspring. Like you said, a new family of God that's being produced. And then it makes me wonder with this Middle Platonism and as Paul's out here getting people to come to the Christ movement and take in the pneuma of God to become children of God, it makes me think about this biological aspect of first trying to get these Jews who are of a particular pedigree in which these non-Jews whom he's going after are now being able to join the family of Abraham, but also being co-heirs with Christ and like literally joining into that family line, which goes vertical. There's so many things that's why when I asked you, like, do you think we already figured the guy out? And now you're like, no, I think we're like miles away and like we're still trying to figure out the details and like this guy's confusing. And thanks to, I guess, like quick doctrines and dogmas and probably the conflicts going on really early on between Christians. Why do you think that is? Why do you think we kind of lost who he is? Is just constant
Well,
evolution?
there are a few ways that you can explain that trajectory. I mean, one is that it's been a relatively recent thing to think that there is a different way to interpret scripture. If Holy Scripture is a revelation from God, then its interpretation over thousands of years is going to morph and change, and you're not necessarily going to go back and try to pick that apart, right? It's like, if it's an ongoing revelation and that's the attitude you take towards it, who cares what he said in Greek in the first century and where it came from, right? Like it's kind of the attitude and the questions you bring towards it. And then you have other factors like translation. We're not reading, I mean, some people still read the Greek, or they might have, like, aren't there like Bibles where the Greek is there with, like, I
Yeah.
think they call them interlinears or something like
But
that.
it's not, most people don't have them, but yeah.
But I mean, I don't want to exclude any of the like super nerds out there, but
Right,
there are
right, right.
people who, try to read things in that way and understand how the language comes together. But if you're not also reading the Stoics, then like maybe you don't know how to connect those things, right?
Hmm.
So because of the evolution of the theology, let's just call it that, the theological readings of scripture, coupled with things like translation changes, and as you say, doctrine, all these things coming together, these texts have moved through history in a different way, and they've become adapted to different contexts and languages and peoples and places and needs for the people who use them. But what we're doing is something different, right? Which is to
Mhm.
say, who was this guy? Like, there's the guy that you see in iconography, or you hear his letters read in like snippets from a pulpit, but that is clearly not the context of this Pharisee from the diaspora who is talking to Gentiles, right? Like that
Right.
it's a very, very different thing when you go back and try to ask the question, how would he have been understood in his historical moment, but also what was influencing him in that historical moment? And those are different questions, and they're not questions that everybody wants to ask. But if you do want to ask them, you can come to
Yeah.
the NINT conference at the end of September.
I am looking forward to that. That's going to be amazing. There's some really amazing academics there that I love and I want to learn from. That includes you. We can't wait to see what you say.
I'm going to
I,
talk about death, I think. Just to,
wow.
I mean, like, I think my PowerPoint was due to them yesterday. But hey, I'll have something. I've been working on it, but I think what I want to talk about, actually is, because I've talked about pneuma before. And so my plan right now is to talk about how Paul conceives the afterlife from this philosophical perspective, but also coupling that with how he understood cosmology, because they're related in the
Yep.
ancient world. And so specifically, we back to this idea of theology developing over time, we have an afterlife imaginary that I think is very influenced by things like Dante, or, talking about things like heaven and hell. And we have very specific ideas in our head in modernity about what that meant. And I don't think this is what Paul has in mind at all. And so when he talks about these issues, like in 1 Corinthians 15, I want to go back to that passage, especially in my presentation, and untangle that, from this philosophical influence and perspective. What does he think the afterlife looks like? And part of that relates to this idea that he keeps saying, that the Messiah or Christ is going to come back. Where does he think he is? Right? Like all of these
Right.
things relate to how he's using this philosophical language in his letters. So I think that's what I'm gonna
I have one
present.
question, and you probably don't have to address this in your conference pertaining to death, but there's a group, very minority group among Christians who, according to most Christians, they probably call them heretics. They're called full preterists. They think that the parousia, they think the final resurrection happened in 70 AD. How do they do that? Resurrection from the dead does not mean literally from the dead. So they make death not mean death at all. It is spiritual, it's covenantal, it's not literal physical. What is your opinion as an expert on Paul about reading death as not actual death?
That works. Actually, I could see how that works in a way, for a couple of reasons. One is that Paul sometimes will refer, I think, to death as sleeping. So he'll talk about the one sleeping, and we translate it as death, but he's not saying death in that traditional way. And I think it's because he sees physical death as not the end. And so one thing that he also talks about that might pertain to this too, in addition to like the physical death not being the end, is when he talks about death as kind of the finality of it, he sometimes talks about death of the soul. So I think this is something he talks about in Romans in particular. And there's a scholar named Emma Wasserman who has written a couple of books on this, and a few articles. But I think for Paul, the worst thing is to be such an amoral person that your soul just basically withers on the vine, that it dies, that there's no hope for it. There's no
Hmm.
hope for improvement. There's no hope for redemption. There's no hope for resurrection. And I would read Paul as saying that that's the worst fate than just being asleep,
Right.
right? Because your pneumatic body, your spiritual body is the one that matters. And if you're damaging that, right? Like you can damage the physical body, you're still going to go on. But if you damage the spiritual body, that's the true end for you. So I don't know anything about this group that you're talking about,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I can see philosophically or theologically, some ways in which Paul actually provides you the material to kind of ping off in that direction and have that
Just
kind
to
of
give a
reading.
little more my mind is I look at like 1 Corinthians 15 and I see using the philosophical approach that you're describing, but I also see that there is a real overcoming of this mortal flesh. And yeah, they
Yeah.
call it sleep, but it's always been my understanding that he is saying we're going to, you know, not stay dead physically. Like there's this
Yeah.
expectation of an actual resurrection. But that's what I've always thought. What's your take on that?
Yeah, and that's part of what I'm going to talk about, because he talks about receiving that pneuma, and then he actually distinguishes between types of flesh in the text. and different types of bodies. And he essentially, this is kind of cutting some corners, but he essentially says that once you've received God's pneuma, you're going to have a body that he uses this word in Greek called doxa. You're going to have this body that's basically more in kind with things like the stars and
Got it.
more in kind with like the celestial bodies than a fish, right? Like I think he talked like he badmouths fish and birds or something like that. But he talks about how you're going to be more in kind with those things. So one of the things that I think Paul actually has in mind, and that I will argue, is that when he talks about, he often talks about things like the third heaven, right? Like rising up. The philosophers talk about this too, because if you're made of pneumatic stuff, they actually had an idea that there were like layers to what we would call the atmosphere. So if you're made of physical material, of course you're going to be stuck on the ground. But if you're actually made of pneumatic stuff, if you're more like the stuff you're going to see, in the stars, then where are you going to go? You're going to like helium, you're going to rise up. So you're going to hang out like in the tier of heaven that you're more suited to.
Right.
And so like when you hear, I hope when you hear it that way, it kind of makes sense, right? Like, so
Right.
when he emphasizes that, who would be scared of death in that case? Like, who wants this physical stuff anyway, that gets sick, that dies, right? That struggles with food and sex and right? Like, it's nothing but like, this flesh case is nothing but problems. But
Right. Right.
if you have this spiritual stuff, like who wouldn't want to go like hang out on the Milky Way instead? So that's basically what he's offering in that case. And again, a lot of philosophers talk about this.
I definitely I need to learn more of this from you. This is amazing. Um you have been taken there's like a blurb of an interview you did with one of my friends on YouTube. I can't remember which one, where they take this clip from you and there's this group who wants to say all of Paul's Gentiles are literally biologically, according to these letters, lost Israelites. Like literally, like they're not just like actual pagans, non-Jews in the literal sense. Because they'll identify Jews as Judeans and they'll say these are actually from the northern kingdom Israelites. So they
Mm.
heard you say something like in some way they took the context of you saying that Paul views his Gentiles as also Jews in the literal flesh sense or something. Can you flesh out what you're trying to get at? Because it was my
Yeah.
understanding, correct me if I'm wrong, because I don't want to push you into this answer.
Mhm.
From my understanding, Paul's looking back in his scriptures and he sees there was one time when all humanity, that meant before Israel, before there was even a distinction between tribes and stuff like that, there was all humanity worshiping God. And he has this utopian idea that one day, or maybe he's the last guy on the block who's going to help get all humanity back on track in worshiping the one true God before the end.
Mhm.
That's his attempt, which meant his mission is not to like not stepping on Jason Staples' toes, but his mission is not toward ethnic anyone. It's anyone and everyone can come into this family of God, and by doing so, you become a child of Abraham through the pneuma, which gets into the whole philosophy thing.
Yeah,
Help me
exactly.
out. What's going on? Do you think
Okay.
those are actual Jews?
So you have to remember that Paul, as a Pharisee, his job is to read scripture and interpret it, right? Because stuff like this happens, right?
Exactly.
Like, this was the whole purpose of the Pharisees. Like once you had the Jewish holy books, like once you had Jewish scripture, you can't really change that, right? Like, I mean, we all know things get changed and, scribes screw up and like that. I'm not talking about that, but I'm talking about like, the core teachings of or the law, right? Like they're a law there that's like on the books. And so somebody like Paul, as a Pharisee, his job is to interpret that. So, of course, he has a very kind of flexible mind when it comes to how to interpret these things because that's what he does all day long, right? So, the way he understands the scriptures, and here in the back of my head, I'm thinking about Romans or Galatians. I think he does this a lot in Galatians, is he tries to explain how he knows that there is a new covenant that has been, because of Jesus's faithfulness and his death, a new covenant has been established between God and his people, and in this case, Gentiles. Why he says this is that, like kind of like what you said at the beginning, all people were children of God, right? They were all understanding that the God of what is now the Judeans was the God of all people. But some people fell away. So when I say this, I always think about like the golden calf, right? Like some people just got caught up with idols. They got caught up with the passions. They deviated from the law. They deviated from God's covenant with his people, the Jewish people, what we would call the Jewish people, and the laws put forth to establish that covenant between God and his people. So they are doing all these things. That's why I was saying Romans, like Romans 1. Like, here are all the things that show that you're breaking God's law, that you're breaking God's covenant, which makes you, apart from God. So these Gentiles, these non-Jews, are people who for generations have away. What Paul sees as his task is, he says that he was chosen before his birth to essentially be the messenger that a new covenant has come because, again, of Jesus's faithfulness and his resurrection, which means his defeat of death. That faithfulness, like Moses's faithfulness, like Abraham's faithfulness, has created this precondition for a new covenant to be established to bring in those people who had fallen away back into the fold, right? So there are two things you have to keep in mind here. One is that we're now talking about two different covenants. The original, like the OG covenant between God and his people, that was broken by some. And a certain number of those people, those Gentiles who have broken away, now have the opportunity to establish a new covenant through Jesus to get back into that fold.
And so
So
when you say Gentiles, just so we're clear,
yeah,
this is not a particular ethnic group.
they're non-Jews, right? Like,
Okay.
so that Gentile just means like they're no longer Judeans. Like the word Judaios basically means like your God is in Judea. Right.
Got it.
And then it develops, and there are people, again, like, it's more complicated than that because it is, essentially like you say, an ethnic categorization. But these non-Jews are just people who don't recognize the God in Judea, who don't follow the laws that were established between God and his people, the Judean people, in that covenant. But this new covenant that Paul's talking about, it involves different things, right? So that's why it's a new covenant. And that word is not strange to people, or that phrase is not strange to people. That terminology, is understood, I think, within the Jesus movement. So what are some of these, covenantal practices? Things like Eucharist, things like baptism, right? Things like establishing an ecclesia, of which, you have this, wonder working Jesus figure, however we want to construe that, as sort of the patron deity of this thing. And so he is establishing a new kind of covenant where you don't have to necessarily circumcise or follow the dietary laws or any of the other things that were representative of that other covenant that you broke away from. Here's the opportunity to kind of get back into the good graces of the God of Judea and become part of a new covenant and share in the pneuma, share in that spirit. So if you're baptized, you have Eucharist meals, then you're all sharing in that pneuma of Christ. And so therefore you're co-heirs with Christ, therefore you're back in. So I don't worry too much. I should say one thing about my approach. I don't worry as much about like, what does this mean in terms of like, is he converting them, or is this a
Right.
new ethnic group? Or the reason I don't worry about that too much is because I think he's pretty clear about the practices you're supposed to perform. He's clear about the covenant. He's clear about what he's trying to do. But I think he also thinks the end of the world is coming, like TikTok, right? So I think that, and that might be my own personal bias, so that's why I want to state it up front. But I think that he's not as worried about like, so what does this mean going forward for that? Like, he gets pissed when like they circumcise, like, you don't need to do that, like that's kind of the tone of his letter. Like, I told you, morons, like, you don't need to do this. Like,
Yeah.
why are you doing X, Y? Like, so in that sense, he's being very clear, like, you are not Jews, right?
Right.
In the sense that you don't do the covenantal things for that covenant because you have this one, right? It's not to say like it's a bad thing, right? Like, it's not exactly that. It's just like,
Isn't he kind
you
of
don't have to
steering them
do.
away from going back to an original covenant practice where he's saying like under
It's
the
just not their
new,
covenant,
yeah,
Yeah, like, it's not for them. Like,
yeah.
like, what was the point? Like, like, not to, I'm starting to sound like, I'm not, I'm not angry, but like channeling Paul, it's like, why did Jesus go through all of this if you're just gonna go circumcise, right? Like, why don't you understand about what I just explained to you, right? Like, that's kind of his attitude about it.
Right.
And I think our frameworks of conversion or our frameworks about like, so what does this mean long term in terms of like how do we categorize it? Those are concerns of a later time.
Right. The end didn't happen. Now we need to rationalize and keep this. How are we going to keep living on since the end hasn't happened? We have 4 minutes before Zoom shuts me down. Robyn, can you tell us what to look forward to with this conference? And also, there's going to be a private. You and Jennifer Knust, Dr. Knust, are going to, isn't it Knust? I hope I'm pronouncing that properly. Are going to be dialoguing on Paul and sexuality or something to this effect.
Yeah, we're still developing what it's going to be, but there is a special, so there are a couple of VIP events, I guess they're calling them. There's some kind of mixer where I think it's just kind of open Q&A with a few scholars, and I think that's before the conference, or sometime, roughly around. And then Jenny and I are going to do a separate event where we're still talking about what we're going to do, but it's essentially going to be talking about sexual ethics in Paul. And I think we'll probably take some different perspectives, but you'll have the opportunity to essentially hear us kind of both give a presentation on how we understand Paul's sexual ethics, and then talk about where we overlap and where we might have some disagreements. And so it's an opportunity to have more of a dynamic experience of hearing how scholars sort these things out. I think Jenny and I are probably pretty aligned on a lot of things, but so it's not going to be like some contentious, toxic debate. I don't anticipate that. But we come from different training and different perspectives on these things somewhat. So I don't mean to be vague, but we're trying not to like choreograph it too much. Like we know what the topic is, we know our positions, and we want to kind of come in and organically let this conversation develop. So it's the first time that we're offering that as part of the conference. And I think it's going to be, it won't quite be celebrity death match or anything like that, but it's going to be, I think it'll be an interesting opportunity to just take a different like approach to how to talk about these things.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, the link is on the screen. We pinned it in the top comment, so you can go and click there, or in the description of this video. Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh. Sorry, I'm over here. Let me pause. I was like, I almost called you Jennifer.
Yeah.
I almost called you Jennifer. Dr. Robyn Faith Walsh, thank you so much for your time. Everybody, go sign up. And if you want the VIP, there's different packages. Please, looking forward to seeing you at the conference. And don't forget, she has courses as well. So I can't wait to see more and more of your information being spread. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Let me end it. How do you end the... Okay, there it is.